Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have notifications turned on because stories like this don't come around often. What started as a simple family project in a quiet American neighborhood turned into the discovery of a secret buried for more than 60 years, a backyard, a shovel, and a truth no one expected to be uncovered. Stay with us until the end to learn how an ordinary man's decision revealed a crime from 1961, exposed a long-hidden secret, and changed an entire family's life forever. The house came into their lives quietly, without drama, without ceremony, almost as if it had been waiting. For months, Daniel Harper and his family had been searching for something they could afford, something that would finally allow them to stop moving from rental to rental, counting every dollar and wondering when the next lease increase would arrive. They wanted stability more than perfection, space more than luxury, and a place where their children could grow without the constant feeling of impermanence. When the listing appeared online late one evening, Daniel almost scrolled past it, assuming it was another property that would be snapped up before they even had a chance to visit. The photographs showed a modest single-family home in a quiet Midwestern town, the kind of place most people pass through without noticing. The neighborhood streets were lined with mature trees and aging sidewalks. The houses set back behind lawns that had clearly been tended by generations of owners. The home itself was older, built decades earlier, with a wide backyard and a simple, functional layout. Nothing about it was flashy, nothing about it promised luxury, and yet the price was far lower than anything else they had seen that offered the same amount of space. Daniel read the listing twice, then a third time. The square footage was right. The yard was unusually large for the area. The location was close to schools, parks, and grocery stores. There was no obvious reason for the low price. The description mentioned only that the seller was motivated and wanted a quick closing. Daniel felt a flicker of suspicion, but it was quickly overshadowed by a feeling he had learned not to ignore, a quiet sense that this might be their chance. His wife, Laura, shared his cautious optimism. They had learned over the years to temper excitement with practicality, especially where money was concerned. Still, when they drove to see the house a few days later, both of them felt something shift. The house was not perfect. The paint showed its age, the kitchen was outdated, and some of the fixtures were clearly remnants of another era. But it was solid. The structure felt sturdy. The rooms were filled with light. The backyard stretched farther than either of them had expected, a wide open space bordered by trees that created a natural sense of privacy. Their children ran ahead of them, already claiming imaginary bedrooms, already chasing each other across the grass as if the yard belonged to them. Daniel watched them and felt a tightening in his chest, a mixture of hope and fear. He had promised himself years ago that someday he would give his family something permanent, something that belonged to them. Standing there, with the house rising quietly behind him and his children laughing in the yard, that promise felt closer than it ever had. The seller was an older man who spoke little and seemed eager to move on. He answered questions politely but without elaboration. When Daniel asked about the history of the house, the man shrugged and said it had been in his possession for many years, that it had served its purpose, and that it was time for someone else to take over. There was no warmth in his voice, but no hostility either. Just a sense of detachment, as if the house were nothing more than an object he was finally ready to part with. The inspection revealed nothing alarming. There were the usual notes about aging systems and cosmetic issues, but nothing structural, nothing dangerous. The backyard, the inspector noted, was unusually untouched, with no major renovations or additions in decades. Daniel barely paid attention to that detail at the time. All he could think about was the fact that, for once, the numbers worked. If they emptied their savings, if they were careful, if nothing went terribly wrong, they could actually own this place. They signed the papers 3 weeks later. The day they moved in was overcast, the kind of soft gray day that made everything feel muted and calm. Their furniture filled the rooms unevenly, leaving empty spaces that would take time to become familiar. The house creaked and settled in the evenings, making sounds that Daniel had never noticed in newer rentals. At first, those sounds unsettled him. Then slowly they began to feel comforting, like evidence that the house was alive in its own quiet way. The first weeks passed in a blur of unpacking, school registrations, and adjusting to a new routine. Daniel drove to work each morning through unfamiliar streets, learning the rhythms of traffic and the shortcuts locals seemed to know instinctively. Laura focused on making the house feel like home, arranging furniture, hanging photographs, filling the kitchen cabinets. The children adapted the fastest, as children always do, making friends at school and exploring the neighborhood with fearless curiosity. The backyard became the center of their evenings. After dinner, they would step outside and watch the sky shift colors as the sun went down. The children invented games, running back and forth across the grass, turning the open space into whatever their imaginations demanded. Daniel often stood near the edge of the yard, looking out over it with a sense of ownership that still felt unreal. The space was larger than anything they had ever had before. It felt full of possibility. Money, however, lingered in the background of every thought. The house had consumed everything they had saved. Unexpected expenses appeared almost immediately. Small things at first, then larger ones. A repair here, a replacement there. Daniel tracked every expense carefully, recalculating budgets late at night while the house slept. They were managing, but just barely. There was no room for indulgence, no room for major projects. For now, survival and stability were enough. And yet, as the weeks turned into months, Daniel found his thoughts returning again and again to the backyard. It was too large, too open, too full of potential to remain just a patch of grass. On hot afternoons, he imagined water shimmering in the sunlight, imagined his children learning to swim, imagined laughter carrying across the yard. He said nothing at first, knowing the idea bordered on irresponsible. But the thought took root all the same. By the time summer approached, the house no longer felt foreign. The walls had absorbed their voices. The floors had learned the pattern of their footsteps. Neighbors waved as they passed, no longer strangers, but familiar faces. The low price of the house faded from memory, becoming just another fortunate detail in a long list of things that had somehow gone right. Daniel believed fully and without reservation that they had been lucky. He did not know then that the yard he admired so often had remained undisturbed for reasons no inspection could reveal. He did not know that the soil beneath his feet held a story far older than his family's presence, a story waiting patiently beneath layers of earth. All he knew was that he had a home, that his children were happy, and that the future, for the first time in years, felt open and full of promise. That sense of promise, that quiet confidence in the life they were building, would be what finally led him to make a decision that seemed small at the time. A decision rooted in love, necessity, and hope. A decision that would draw him, shovel in hand, into the ground where the past had been carefully hidden, waiting for someone to uncover it. The idea did not arrive all at once. It took shape gradually, forming in Daniel Harper's mind over the course of many ordinary days. The kind that blended together so completely they were almost indistinguishable. It began with the heat. Summer settled over the town earlier than usual, heavy and persistent, pressing down on the house and the yard alike. By mid-morning, the grass shimmered under the sun, and by afternoon the air felt thick enough to touch. The children complained about the temperature, their energy dulled by the heat, their games growing shorter as they retreated indoors to sit in front of fans. Daniel noticed how often they looked out the back window, their eyes drawn to the wide stretch of lawn that, for all its promise, offered little relief from the heat. He noticed how they talked about friends who had pools, about afternoons spent splashing and laughing somewhere else. Each time, he felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the same feeling he had known since childhood, when he understood that wanting something and being able to afford it were two very different things. At first, he dismissed the thought as unrealistic. Pools were expensive, complicated, and far beyond what they could manage after pouring every dollar they had into the house. He had always been careful, always measured, always the one to say no when dreams threatened to outpace reality. But the idea lingered, returning again and again, reshaping itself into something that felt less like fantasy and more like a possibility he could at least examine. He began to research quietly. Late at night when the house was still, he read articles, watched videos, and scanned forums where homeowners shared their experiences. Professional installations were immediately ruled out. The costs were staggering, far beyond what they could justify. Even small prefabricated options seemed out of reach. Every estimate ended the same way, with Daniel closing his laptop and shaking his head, reminding himself that this was not the time. And yet the backyard remained, wide, flat, and empty. He started to imagine doing the work himself, piece by piece, spreading the effort out over time. He had never considered himself especially skilled, but he was patient, persistent, and willing to learn. The more he read, the more the ideas shifted from impossible to merely difficult. Difficult he could handle. He did not speak of it at first. He carried the thought with him as he mowed the lawn, as he repaired a loose step, as he stood at the edge of the yard watching the children chase each other in the evening light. The yard felt like an unfinished sentence, a space waiting to become something more. He told himself that even if he never followed through, there was no harm in thinking. Eventually, he mentioned it to Laura, carefully, framing it not as a plan, but as a distant possibility. She listened, skeptical but not dismissive. She reminded him gently of their finances, of the risks of taking on a project like that without professional help. Daniel agreed with everything she said. He had no intention of rushing into something reckless, but he also saw in her eyes the same flicker of interest he felt himself, the same quiet longing to give their children something memorable, something joyful. They talked about it over several evenings, returning to the subject whenever the heat became unbearable or the children's restlessness filled the house. Slowly, the idea stopped sounding irresponsible and began to sound deliberate. They would not hire anyone. They would not take on debt. If it happened at all, it would happen through time, effort, and restraint. Daniel would do the work himself, carefully and cautiously, stopping the moment something felt wrong. The decision, when it finally came, was understated. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic moment of commitment. One Saturday morning, Daniel stood in the backyard with a tape measure and a notebook, marking out a modest space near the center of the yard. He imagined the shape of it, the depth, the way it might fit naturally into the landscape. It would not be large or elaborate. It would be enough. He bought a shovel that afternoon, heavier than the one he had used for gardening, solid and practical. Holding it, he felt a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was not something he had ever done before. There were risks, unknowns, and 1,000 ways it could go wrong. But there was also a sense of purpose he had been missing, a tangible goal that extended beyond bills and responsibilities. He began the next day. The first hours of digging were deceptively easy. The top layer of soil gave way readily, dry and loose from the heat. Daniel worked steadily, stopping often to rest, aware of his limits. The children watched from a distance, fascinated by the transformation of their familiar yard. Laura checked on him frequently, offering water and reminding him not to push too hard. Daniel listened. He was determined to approach the project with patience, not pride. As the days passed, the work became harder. The soil grew denser, heavier, resisting the shovel with increasing stubbornness. Daniel adjusted his pace, breaking the work into manageable sessions. He felt every muscle protest, felt fatigue settle into his bones. And yet each time he stepped back and looked at the growing depression in the ground, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Progress, however slow, was still progress. Neighbors noticed and waved as they passed, some offering encouragement, others curiosity. Daniel kept his explanation simple. He was building something for his kids. Most people understood that instinct immediately. It required no further justification. There were moments of doubt, moments when he stood at the edge of the hole and wondered if he had made a mistake. The scale of the task became clearer with each shovelful of dirt. This was not a weekend project. This was something that would demand weeks, perhaps months of effort. Still, he continued, guided by the image that had started it all, of his children laughing in water instead of staring out a window at heat-shimmered grass. As the hole deepened, Daniel grew more cautious. He paid attention to changes in the soil, to the way the ground responded to his efforts. He read more, learned more, adjusted his approach. This was no longer just an idea. It was a commitment he was carrying out with his own hands. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that the ground beneath him had not been disturbed in generations, that the resistance he would soon encounter was not simply the stubbornness of earth, but the silent presence of something placed there deliberately, something meant to remain hidden. Each careful movement of his shovel brought him closer to a boundary that separated the life he was building from a story that had ended decades before. For now, though, all Daniel felt was determination. He wiped sweat from his brow, sank the shovel into the soil once more, and kept digging, unaware that his simple decision, born from love and necessity, was leading him toward a discovery that would alter the meaning of the house, the yard, and everything he believed he knew about the place he now called home. By the second week of digging, the backyard no longer looked like the open, welcoming space Daniel remembered from the day they moved in. The grass had been peeled back and stacked carefully to one side, the soil beneath exposed in widening arcs that traced the shape he had imagined for the pool. The work had settled into a rhythm that felt almost meditative. Each morning before the heat grew oppressive, and each evening when the sun dipped low enough to make the air bearable, Daniel returned to the hole with his shovel, measuring progress not in feet but in effort. The earth resisted him more now. The deeper he went, the heavier it became, compacted by time and neglect. He adjusted his stance, learned how to angle the shovel to break through stubborn layers without exhausting himself too quickly. His movements were slower, more deliberate, guided by a growing awareness that mistakes at this depth could have consequences. He took breaks often, standing at the edge of the hole and stretching his aching back, reminding himself that there was no deadline beyond his own patience. The children watched less frequently as the novelty wore off, though they still asked each evening how much deeper he had gone. Laura continued to worry quietly, her concern expressed through small gestures rather than words. Extra water left within reach, reminders to stop when he felt tired, a watchful eye that followed him from the kitchen window whenever he worked alone. It was during one of those solitary sessions, late in the afternoon, when the yard seemed unnaturally still, that the shovel struck something that did not feel like soil. The sensation traveled up the handle and into Daniel's arms, a dull, jarring resistance that stopped the blade cold. At first he assumed it was a rock. The Midwest was full of them, remnants of ancient shifts beneath the land. He repositioned himself and tried again, driving the shovel down with a bit more force. The sound that followed was unmistakable, sharper and more solid than the stone against metal. It echoed faintly in the hole, wrong enough to make him pause. He stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet that followed, his heart beating faster than it should have. There was no reason to be alarmed. Rocks happened. Buried debris happened. Old construction materials were often forgotten beneath lawns. Still, something about the way the shovel had stopped, the way the resistance felt uniform rather than jagged, unsettled him. He knelt and brushed away loose dirt with his hands, working carefully now, the way he had learned to do whenever uncertainty crept in. The soil gave way to a flat surface, smooth beneath his fingers. He cleared more dirt, revealing a straight edge, then another. The shape emerging from the ground was not natural. It was deliberate, geometric, too precise to be anything left there by chance. Daniel's mouth went dry. He told himself again that it could be something harmless. An old concrete slab, a buried utility cover, something forgotten but explainable. He continued to uncover it slowly, methodically, his movements cautious, almost reverent. As more of the object came into view, the truth became impossible to ignore. It was wood, not splintered, not rotted beyond recognition, but preserved, its surface worn smooth by time rather than decay. The corners were rounded, the lines unmistakably intentional. Daniel felt a wave of disbelief wash over him, followed by a creeping dread that settled into his chest. He had stopped thinking about the pool entirely. All that mattered now was the thing beneath the ground, the thing that should not have been there. He cleared the dirt away from one side, then the other, until the outline was fully visible. The object was long, longer than any container he could reasonably explain away. The realization came slowly, resisted by his mind even as his hands confirmed it inch by inch. When it finally settled, it did so with a weight that left him lightheaded. It was a coffin. Daniel sat back on his heels, staring at it, his thoughts scattered and disordered. Coffins belonged in cemeteries, not backyards. They belonged to rituals and closure, not to secret burial beneath family homes. The world around him felt suddenly unreal, as if the yard, the house, and even the sky above had shifted into something unfamiliar. He considered briefly covering it back up, pretending he had never seen it. The thought passed almost as quickly as it arrived, replaced by a stronger, unavoidable need to know. He had already crossed a line. The ground had given up its secret, and he could not simply ignore it. Working with renewed caution, Daniel uncovered the top of the coffin completely. The wood was darkened but intact, the lid sealed with fittings dulled by decades underground. There was no mistaking what it was meant to hold. His hands trembled as he reached for the edge, a part of him still hoping, irrationally, that opening it would reveal something else, something less horrifying. When he lifted the lid, the smell that escaped was dry and old, not the stench he had feared, but something far more unsettling in its stillness. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a human body, arranged carefully, deliberately. Time had stripped away everything but bone and fragments of fabric, leaving behind a silent testament to a life ended and hidden. Beside the skeleton were objects that did not belong with death. Heavy bags, their material stiff with age. A metal container, sealed and intact. Daniel did not touch them at first, his gaze fixed on the remains, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with the reality he had known just moments before. This was not an accident. This was not a careless burial. Someone had gone to great lengths to place this here, to hide it, to ensure it would not be found. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, bringing with it a surge of fear. His home, the place he had believed to be safe and ordinary, had been built over something deeply wrong. His children played above this ground. His family slept within steps of it. The thought made his stomach churn. He climbed out of the hole on unsteady legs and walked toward the house, his movements automatic, his mind distant. Laura saw him through the window and immediately sensed that something was wrong. He did not need to explain. The look on his face was enough. He took his phone and made the call that would change everything, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding in his thoughts. The wait that followed felt unreal. He sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a glass of water he did not drink, listening to the sounds of the house. Everything was the same. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant laughter of children playing inside. The ordinary details felt painfully out of place against what he had uncovered outside. When authorities arrived, the backyard transformed quickly. The quiet space where Daniel had worked alone became a controlled scene filled with measured movements and careful documentation. The coffin was examined, the contents cataloged with a precision that underscored the seriousness of the discovery. The bags and container were opened, revealing what Daniel had only glimpsed in shock. It was treasure, unmistakably so. Cash preserved against decay. Financial instruments from another era. Items that spoke of wealth acquired suddenly and hidden just as quickly. The presence of these objects alongside the remains shifted the narrative immediately. This was no ordinary burial. This was the end of a story that had begun long before Daniel and his family ever imagined owning the house. As the sun set and the yard filled with unfamiliar faces, Daniel stood back and watched, feeling both distant and deeply involved. The ground he had dug into with simple intentions had revealed more than he could have imagined. What had begun as an effort to give his children joy had uncovered a mystery rooted in crime, secrecy, and time itself. The house no longer felt the same. Even before the authorities confirmed what the discovery meant, Daniel sensed that the life he had been building here had shifted irrevocably. The backyard, once a symbol of possibility, had become a threshold between past and present. And as investigators began to piece together the significance of what lay beneath the soil, it became clear that this discovery would not end with the removal of a coffin. It was only the beginning. Once the authorities took control of the backyard, time seemed to lose its normal rhythm. What had been Daniel Harper's private project, carried out slowly and carefully over weeks, became something else entirely within hours. The yard was no longer a family space or a work site born of quiet determination. It was a place of measured steps, careful glances, and deliberate procedures. The earth Daniel had moved with a shovel was now being examined inch by people trained to read meaning into disturbed soil, forgotten objects, and long silence remains. Daniel watched from the edge of the property as the discovery was documented. The coffin was left in place at first, its presence confirmed, but not disturbed further until specialists arrived. The remains were treated with a seriousness that made the reality of the situation impossible to deny. This was not folklore or rumor. This was a human life, ended long ago, hidden deliberately and forgotten by everyone except the ground itself. As the investigation progressed, attention quickly shifted from the physical discovery to the objects found alongside the skeleton. The bags in the metal container were opened under controlled conditions. Their contents were preserved far better than Daniel had expected. Paper currency from another era, bundled and protected from moisture, financial instruments bearing dates that had no place in the present, items that spoke clearly of theft, concealment, and intention. It became obvious to everyone involved that this was not simply a death that had been hidden, but the final chapter of a crime that had never been resolved. The investigators began tracing the timeline backward, anchoring their questions in the only solid reference point they had, the house itself. Records were pulled, ownership histories examined, names and dates compiled with methodical care. The house, so ordinary in appearance, began to take on a different weight as its past unfolded. Decades earlier, it had belonged to a man whose name appeared again and again in old documents, reports, and yellowed newspaper clippings. The year that kept surfacing was 1961. In that year, the town had been smaller, quieter, far less connected to the wider world. Banking records from the time told a story of a significant robbery that had shaken the community. A local bank had been emptied of a large sum of money in a single well-planned act. The suspect had been a resident of the town, a man known to authorities but never formally convicted. He had vanished shortly after the robbery, leaving behind unanswered questions, incomplete evidence, and a case that eventually grew cold. That man, the investigators now believed, had lived in Daniel's house. The pieces began to align with unsettling clarity. The disappearance, the missing money, the lack of a body, the absence of closure. For decades, the assumption had been that the suspect had fled, taking the stolen wealth with him, starting a new life somewhere beyond reach. That narrative had been repeated so often it had hardened into accepted truth. No one had thought to look beneath the lawn of an unremarkable home, beneath soil that appeared undisturbed, beneath a yard that had passed from one owner to another without incident. Daniel learned all of this in fragments, overheard conversations, and careful explanations offered by investigators who understood the impact such information could have on a family. Each new detail made the situation feel heavier, more unreal. The house he had bought as a symbol of stability was now a focal point of a story that stretched back more than 60 years. His children's bedrooms sat above a space that had once concealed the aftermath of a violent crime. The thought was almost impossible to process. The investigators treated Daniel and his family with respect, making it clear that they were not suspects, not complicit in any way. They were witnesses to chance, drawn into a story that had nothing to do with them except for geography and timing. Still, the presence of law enforcement became constant. Vehicles lined the street. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. The quiet anonymity of the neighborhood dissolved into whispered speculation. As days passed, the remains were removed and transported for further analysis. The coffin, its purpose fulfilled long ago, was taken away as evidence. The backyard, once a simple stretch of grass, was left scarred and marked, its future uncertain. Daniel found himself unable to look at it without imagining the careful planning that had gone into burying the truth there. Someone had chosen that exact spot. Someone had believed it would never be disturbed. The investigation into the crime itself deepened. Records from 1961 painted a picture of a man who had lived on the margins of respectability. He had no known accomplices, no close family ties that could explain his disappearance. The robbery had been precise, suggesting intelligence and preparation rather than desperation. Yet the end he met, buried beneath his own stolen wealth, suggested betrayal, conflict, or a plan that had gone wrong. The presence of the treasure alongside the remains raised further questions. Why hide the money with the body instead of retrieving it later? Why leave behind the very thing that had motivated the crime? Investigators theorized that the man may never have had the chance to return, that someone else had been involved, that the burial was not an act of reverence but of finality. Daniel listened as theories were discussed, each one darker than the last. The past, once abstract and distant, had become tangible, rooted in the land he owned. The ground had not simply revealed a body, it had forced a reckoning with a story that had been misremembered for generations. Media attention followed quickly. The discovery of a long-missing robbery suspect beneath a suburban backyard was too compelling to ignore. Reporters arrived, drawn by the collision of ordinary family life and buried crime. Daniel did his best to shield his family from the attention, but the sense of exposure was unavoidable. The house was no longer just theirs. It had become a symbol, a curiosity, a place where history had refused to stay hidden. Through it all, Daniel found himself returning again and again to the moment his shovel struck something solid. That small, seemingly insignificant resistance had marked the boundary between ignorance and knowledge. He had crossed it unknowingly, guided by nothing more than a desire to give his children something joyful. Now, standing at the edge of a past he had never asked to uncover, he understood how fragile the present could be. The investigation made one thing clear beyond doubt. The story of the house's low price, the urgency of the sale, and the silence surrounding its history were not coincidences. Someone at some point had known exactly what lay beneath the yard. Someone had chosen to let the house change hands quietly, trusting that the secret would remain buried forever. That assumption had been wrong. As authorities continued to work through the evidence, attention began to turn away from the man who had died in 1961 and toward those who had lived with that knowledge afterward. The question was no longer just what had happened all those years ago, but how the truth had been hidden for so long and who had benefited from that silence. For Daniel, the realization was unsettling. The house had been sold cheaply, almost eagerly. The past had not simply been forgotten. It had been avoided. And now, as investigators followed the trail forward through time, it was becoming clear that the story was not finished yet. It was only moving closer to the present. As the investigation pushed forward, the focus shifted with deliberate inevitability away from the grave itself and toward the living. The past had been uncovered, but it had not existed in isolation. Someone had owned the house after 1961. Someone had walked across that yard, mowed the grass, maintained the property, and eventually decided to sell it. The question investigators now asked was no longer limited to how the body had ended up beneath the soil, but how it had remained there for more than 6 decades without discovery, without disclosure, and without a single warning to those who came later. Daniel felt this shift keenly. The discovery had already transformed his understanding of the house, but now it was changing the way he thought about the people connected to it. The former owner, the man who had sold them the property with such quiet urgency, returned to Daniel's thoughts with unsettling clarity. At the time of the sale, Daniel had noticed little beyond his reserved manner and eagerness to close the deal. Now those details felt weighted with meaning. Investigators began reconstructing the house's ownership history in meticulous detail. Deeds, tax records, renovation permits, and inspection reports were examined line by line. The property had not changed hands often. For decades after 1961, it had remained in the possession of a single individual, a man who had acquired it under circumstances that now seemed far from ordinary. He had lived there for years, then rented it out intermittently, maintaining a careful distance while retaining ownership. When he finally decided to sell, he had done so quickly, accepting a price far below market value without negotiation. That decision, investigators believed, was not motivated by finances alone. The former owner was located without difficulty. He was elderly now, living quietly in another state, his life outwardly unremarkable. There was no dramatic resistance when authorities contacted him, no attempt to flee, no outward signs of guilt. He agreed to speak with investigators, confident, it seemed, that time itself had protected him. What emerged during questioning was a portrait of long-held knowledge in deliberate silence. The man admitted that he had known for many years that something was buried in the backyard. He claimed he had discovered evidence of it shortly after acquiring the house, though he insisted he had never seen the coffin itself. He described finding disturbed soil, unusual markings, hints that something beneath the ground did not belong there. Instead of reporting it, instead of investigating further, he had chosen to look away. At first, he framed his decision as fear. Fear of being implicated, fear of consequences, fear of disturbing something he did not fully understand. Over time, that fear had transformed into calculation. As years passed without discovery, the secret grew easier to carry. The house provided stability, income, and a sense of control. The yard remained untouched. No additions were made. No deep digging allowed. The silence became a habit, then a strategy. The stolen wealth buried alongside the body had never been retrieved. Investigators believed the former owner had known it was there, or at least suspected it. Whether he had been involved in the original crime or had simply benefited from the aftermath remained a matter of careful reconstruction. What mattered most was that he had chosen silence, repeatedly and deliberately, allowing the truth to remain hidden while others lived unknowingly above it. That silence explained the price. When Daniel and his family had found the listing, the low cost had seemed like fortune. Now it was clear that it had been insurance. The former owner had wanted the property off his hands quickly, quietly, and without scrutiny. He had counted on the assumption that no one would dig deeply enough to uncover what he had avoided for so long. In selling the house cheaply, he had reduced attention, discouraged extensive renovations, and passed the burden of ignorance onto someone else. That assumption had failed. The evidence against him was not built on speculation alone. Financial records revealed inconsistencies that trace back decades, unexplained assets that aligned too closely with the long-missing robbery funds to be dismissed as coincidence. Witness accounts, old and new, filled in gaps, describing a man who had always been cautious about the property, who discouraged changes, who spoke vaguely but firmly about leaving the yard undisturbed. The arrest, when it came, was quiet. There were no crowds, no dramatic confrontation. The former owner was taken into custody with a kind of weary resignation, as if he had always known this moment might arrive. Age did not shield him from accountability. Time did not erase the consequences of a decision repeated year after year. For Daniel, learning of the arrest brought no satisfaction. There was no sense of justice neatly served, no relief that balanced the upheaval his family had endured. Instead, there was a lingering bitterness, a recognition that his family's suffering had been avoidable. They had been drawn into a story not by fate, but by someone else's deliberate choice to remain silent. The house, once a symbol of hope and careful planning, now felt like an inheritance of secrecy. Daniel struggled with the knowledge that the peace they had sought had been compromised long before they arrived. His children had played above a grave not because of history alone, but because someone had decided their right to safety and truth mattered less than convenience. Public reaction to the arrest was swift. The story, already widespread, took on a new dimension. It was no longer just about a crime from 1961, but about how easily the truth could be buried when silence was rewarded and questions went unasked. The former owner became a symbol of that silence, a reminder that the past often survives not because it is hidden well, but because people choose not to look too closely. As the legal process moved forward, Daniel and his family remained at the center of attention, despite their desire to step away. Their home had become the physical link between decades of wrongdoing and the present. They were praised for coming forward, for cooperating fully, for doing what others had not. None of it changed the fact that their lives had been disrupted in ways they had never anticipated. The backyard remained closed off, a space now defined more by what had been taken from it than by what it might become. The hole Daniel had dug sat unfinished, a stark reminder of how a simple act of effort had unraveled a carefully maintained lie. Each time he looked at it, he was reminded not only of the body that had been buried there, but of the years of silence that had allowed it to remain. As the former owner faced the consequences of his choices, Daniel found himself reflecting on the nature of responsibility. The crime itself belonged to the past, to people long gone, but the silence, the decision to do nothing, to say nothing, to pass the burden forward, that had extended into the present, that more than anything was what had changed the meaning of the house forever. The truth had come at a cost, and that cost had been paid not only by those who hid it, but by those who uncovered it without warning. The low price of the house had not been a gift. It had been the price of silence, deferred for decades, until someone finally dug deep enough to uncover what it was meant to conceal. And with that truth exposed, the story moved toward its final reckoning, one that would determine not only what justice looked like, but what future, if any, the house could still offer. When the investigation finally reached its conclusion, it did so without ceremony. There was no single moment that marked the end, no clear line separating the chaos that had consumed Daniel Harper's life from whatever came next. Instead, resolution arrived gradually, in official notices, quiet confirmations, and the slow withdrawal of attention. The authorities removed the last barriers from the yard. The steady presence of law enforcement vehicles faded from the street. Neighbors returned to their routines, their curiosity satisfied, their interest drifting toward newer distractions. What remained was the house, standing exactly where it had always stood, unchanged in appearance, yet fundamentally altered in meaning. The official findings confirmed what had already become clear through months of investigation. Daniel and his family bore no responsibility for what had been found beneath their yard. They were recognized as accidental discoverers, drawn into a decades-old crime through nothing more than circumstance and effort. The remains were formally identified, cataloged, and transferred to the appropriate authorities. The treasure, once hidden as a final insurance policy or an unfulfilled promise, was seized by the state and returned to public custody, its value calculated not only in currency, but in the closure it provided to a long-forgotten case. The former owner's arrest brought a quiet sense of finality. His explanation, whatever form it took, changed nothing about the choices he had made or the consequences he now faced. The law moved at its own measured pace, unconcerned with the passage of time or the erosion of memory. Silence, once relied upon as protection, had failed. For Daniel, the legal resolution mattered less than the personal reckoning that followed. The house, once imagined as a foundation for stability and growth, now carried a weight he could not ignore. Each room held the same furniture, the same light, the same echoes of daily life. But beneath it all lay the knowledge of what had been hidden there. The backyard, scarred but quiet, felt less like a space of possibility and more like a reminder of boundaries crossed unknowingly. His children sensed the change even if they did not fully understand it. The yard was no longer a place where they ran freely. They asked fewer questions, played closer to the house, absorbed the tension that lingered despite everyone's efforts to shield them. Daniel watched them with a mix of guilt and protectiveness, aware that his desire to give them something joyful had exposed them to something far darker. It was the town's response that surprised him most. In the weeks following the investigation's conclusion, local officials reached out to Daniel with a proposal that felt, at first, almost surreal. The discovery had brought national attention to a small community that rarely found itself in the spotlight. The case had been resolved not through decades of effort, but through the determination of a man digging for his children. That narrative resonated, and it sparked a response rooted in gratitude rather than obligation. Contractors volunteered their time. Suppliers offered materials at no cost. City representatives framed it not as compensation, but as recognition. Daniel resisted initially, uncomfortable with the idea of benefiting from something born of tragedy. But the offer persisted, shaped by a desire to restore something that had been taken from his family's sense of peace. In the end, he agreed. The work began where his own efforts had stopped. What had once been a rough excavation, marked by uncertainty and shock, was transformed through careful planning and professional execution. The ground was stabilized, reshaped, and prepared with a precision Daniel had never been able to achieve alone. The process unfolded over weeks, each stage restoring a sense of order to the space that had become synonymous with upheaval. The pool that emerged was larger and more refined than anything Daniel had ever imagined building himself. It fit naturally into the yard, a deliberate contrast to the secret that had once occupied the same ground. Water filled it slowly, reflecting the sky above, erasing the memory of exposed soil and buried silence. Where the earth had once concealed the past, it now held something open, visible, and alive. For the children, the transformation was immediate. Their laughter returned to the yard, louder and more confident than before. Summer afternoons were reclaimed, reshaped into moments of joy rather than unease. Daniel watched them from a distance, feeling a cautious relief settle into his chest. The pool did not erase what had happened, but it created something new in its place, something that belonged entirely to the present. Laura saw the change in him as well. The tension that had lived in his shoulders since the discovery eased, replaced by a quiet acceptance. They spoke less about the past, choosing instead to focus on what they could control. The house would always carry its history, but it did not have to define their future. The media interest faded as quickly as it had arrived. New stories replaced old ones. The house returned to relative anonymity, its role in history recorded, but no longer sensationalized. The town absorbed the lesson and moved on, the ground beneath it silent once more. Daniel never forgot the moment his shovel struck something solid. That memory remained sharp, a reminder of how easily the present could collide with the past. But as time passed, it lost its power to unsettle him. It became part of a larger understanding, one shaped by the knowledge that truth, once uncovered, did not have to poison everything it touched. On quiet evenings, Daniel stood at the edge of the pool and watched the water settle after his children climbed out. The surface smoothed, reflecting the house, the sky, and the trees beyond the yard. Beneath it all lay earth that had finally given up its secret, no longer burdened by what it had been forced to hold. The house remained imperfect, marked by age and memory, but it was theirs. The future they had hoped for was no longer imagined. It existed, tangible and earned, built not only from effort and sacrifice, but from the courage to confront what lay hidden and choose what to build in its place. The ground had spoken. Daniel had listened. And in doing so, he had reclaimed not just his yard, but the life he intended to live above it. If this story kept you watching until the end, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what comes next. New stories are coming soon, and each one uncovers mysteries you won't hear anywhere else. Take a moment to check out the other videos on the channel. You'll find more true crime, hidden histories, and stories where the past refuses to stay buried. And if this video surprised you, moved you, or made you think, share it with someone who loves stories like this. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.